December 1941. The United States had the 17th largest army in the world, smaller than Romania. Their artillery, obsolete relics from World War I, but in just 3 years, American artillery became 50 times more lethal than anything the world had ever seen. This is the untold story of how the US shocked Nazi Germany with a weapon so devastating it changed warfare forever. In 1940, as Nazi Germany swept across Europe with terrifying speed, American military planners faced an uncomfortable truth they rarely discussed publicly. The United States Army was not prepared for modern warfare. The equipment was outdated, the tactics were obsolete, and training was inadequate. But among all the deficiencies, one stood out as particularly alarming. American artillery was dangerously inferior. Artillery had dominated battlefields since World War I, and every major military power knew it. Battles were won or lost based on who could deliver more explosive firepower more accurately onto enemy positions. The Germans had proven this repeatedly in Poland, France, and the Low Countries. Their artillery coordination was superb, their response times were measured in minutes, and their firepower was devastating. The American situation was embarrassing by comparison. In 1940, the U.S. Army possessed fewer than 900 modern artillery pieces for an army that would need to field millions of men. Most existing guns dated from World War I, designed in 1918 and barely maintained since. Training was limited to perhaps a dozen practice rounds per gun per year because ammunition was scarce and budgets were tight. Officers learned artillery tactics from manuals written in the 1920s that assumed warfare had not changed since the trenches. Communication systems were primitive. Artillery units coordinated through field telephones that required stringing wire across the battlefield, a time-consuming process vulnerable to enemy fire. Radio equipment existed, but was bulky, unreliable, and in short supply. Forward observers, the soldiers who spotted targets and called in fire missions, had no standardized procedures or equipment. They improvised based on experience that most of them did not have: fire direction. The complex mathematics of calculating where shells would land was done manually using maps, slide rules, and printed firing tables. A trained crew might need 10 or 15 minutes to calculate firing solutions for a single target. If the target moved, or if weather conditions changed, calculations started over. This sluggish response time meant artillery could only engage stationary targets that obligingly remained in place long enough for the guns to find them. The doctrine itself was problematic. American artillery units were organized and trained to support specific infantry divisions. Each division had its own artillery battalion, and those guns were considered the property of that division. Sharing artillery between divisions was complicated, requiring coordination through multiple command levels. Massing fires from multiple artillery battalions onto a single critical target was theoretically possible, but rarely practiced. German artillery, by contrast, operated under centralized fire direction. German commanders could mass fires from dozens of artillery battalions onto single targets within minutes. This concentration of firepower could obliterate defensive positions, suppress enemy artillery, or shatter attacking formations. American artillery could not match this capability, and everyone knew it. Intelligence reports from Europe confirmed the worst fears. German artillery had evolved significantly since World War I. They used motorized vehicles for mobility, radio for communications, and sophisticated fire direction systems. Their 88-meter gun was legendary, equally effective against aircraft, tanks, or infantry. Their Nebelwerfer rocket artillery could saturate entire areas with explosives. The Wehrmacht's artillery arm was a modern, flexible, devastating force. By comparison, American artillery in 1940 looked like a museum exhibit. The standard field gun was the 75mm M1897. a French design from 1897 that the US had manufactured under license during World War I. These guns were accurate enough, but lacked range and hitting power. The ammunition was old, the carriages were worn, and spare parts were scarce. Crews trained on these antiques wondered how they would possibly compete against modern German guns. Senior officers recognized the problem, but disagreed on solutions. Some advocated buying proven foreign designs, particularly British 25-pounders, that had shown effectiveness in combat. Others wanted American-designed weapons, but acknowledged development would take years. Everyone agreed that whatever solution was chosen needed to be implemented quickly because war was coming, and artillery inferiority would cost American lives. What nobody anticipated was that the solution would come not from developing better guns, though that happened, but from revolutionizing how artillery was used. The transformation would be so complete that American artillery would evolve from embarrassingly weak in 1940 to arguably the most effective artillery system in the world by 1944. The change would not happen gradually, but in a single dramatic demonstration that would shock observers and terrify enemies. December 7, 1941, Pearl Harbor shattered any remaining illusions that America could avoid war. Within days, the United States was fighting Japan in the Pacific and Germany in Europe. The army that had numbered barely 200,000 men in 1940 would need to expand to over 8 million. Every aspect of military capability needed rapid expansion, but artillery required particular urgency. American industry responded with characteristic energy. New artillery designs that had been slowly developed during 1940 and 1941 suddenly received massive production orders. The 105mm M2A1 howitzer became the standard divisional artillery piece, replacing the obsolete 75mm guns. The 155mm M1 Long Tom provided heavy firepower for corps-level operations. Production lines that had built tractors and automobiles retooled to manufacture artillery pieces by the thousands. By 1943, American factories were producing artillery at rates that would have seemed impossible 3 years earlier. The 105mm howitzer alone was being manufactured at over 1,000 pieces per month. Ammunition production reached millions of rounds monthly. The industrial capacity that would eventually produce 300,000 aircraft and 90,000 tanks during the war also generated artillery on unprecedented scales, but hardware alone would not solve the fundamental problem. American artillery doctrine remained based on decentralized control and slow response times. New guns firing through old procedures would still be outmatched by German artillery that operated under superior systems. What the army needed was not just more artillery, but a completely different approach to using it. The solution began developing at the Field Artillery School in Fort Sill, Oklahoma. Artillery officers stationed there, safe from combat but intensely aware of reports from the front lines, began analyzing what made German artillery so effective. The answer was not primarily the guns themselves, but the systems surrounding them. Centralized fire direction, rapid communications, massed fires, and flexible command arrangements. A group of officers began developing what they called the Fire Direction Center, or FDC system. The concept was revolutionary for American artillery. Instead of each gun calculating its own firing solution independently, all calculations would be done at a centralized location where trained specialists processed information from multiple observers and directed fires from entire battalions or even multiple battalions simultaneously. The FDC would receive target information from forward observers via radio. Specialists would rapidly calculate firing solutions using improved methods and standardized procedures. Fire commands would be transmitted to gun positions, also by radio. The entire process, from target identification to shells landing, would be measured in minutes rather than the quarter hour or more that current procedures required. Critics within the artillery community argued this was too radical a change to implement during wartime. Crews were already training on new equipment. Adding completely new procedures risked confusion and mistakes. The traditional system, while slow, was at least proven and understood. Trying to teach the entire artillery arm new methods while simultaneously expanding from thousands to hundreds of thousands of men seemed like a recipe for disaster. Proponents countered that incremental improvements would not be sufficient. German artillery was not incrementally better but fundamentally superior in organization and employment. Matching their effectiveness required matching their systems, not just their hardware. If measures would result in American artillery remaining second-rate despite having excellent guns. The debate was resolved by General Leslie McNair, who commanded Army ground forces and was responsible for training and doctrine. McNair recognized that artillery effectiveness would be critical in the European theater. He authorized implementation of the FDC system across all artillery units, with the understanding that the transition would be difficult but necessary. Training programs were redesigned. New field manuals were written. Artillery officers who understood the new system were dispersed throughout the expanding army to teach others. By late 1943, American artillery units deploying to combat theaters were operating under the new doctrine. They had modern guns, abundant ammunition, reliable radio communications, and centralized fire direction. On paper, they were now equal or superior to any artillery force in the world. But paper capabilities and combat performance were different things. The true test would come when American artillery faced German forces in battle. That test would come in Tunisia, and the results would exceed even the most optimistic expectations. February 1943, North Africa. American forces, bloodied at Kasserine Pass just days earlier, were reorganizing and preparing for renewed combat against German and Italian forces. The defeat at Kasserine had been humiliating. German armor and infantry, supported by excellent artillery, had smashed through American defensive positions, inflicting heavy casualties and capturing significant numbers of prisoners. Among the many lessons from Kasserine, one stood out: American artillery had not performed well. Response times were too slow. Communications failed repeatedly. Coordination between artillery battalions was poor. German artillery, by contrast, had demonstrated the devastating effectiveness that intelligence reports had warned about. American gunners knew they needed to perform better, but the question was whether the new systems being implemented would actually work under combat conditions. The opportunity to find out came at a place called Guettar in March 1943. American forces, now under improved leadership and employing revised tactics, established defensive positions blocking German advances. Intelligence indicated a major German attack was imminent, and artillery would be crucial in defeating it. Artillery battalions positioned their guns and established fire direction centers according to the new doctrine. Forward observers moved to positions where they could see approaching enemy forces. Radio networks were tested and confirmed operational. Fire plans were prepared, mapping defensive fires across the likely avenues of German advance. For the first time, American artillery was implementing the centralized fire direction system in actual combat. March 23, 1943. Dawn. German forces launched their attack, led by elements of the 10th Panzer Division. Tanks and mechanized infantry advanced across terrain that American observers were watching intently. The forward observers identified targets and radioed information to fire direction centers. The real test of the new system was about to begin. What happened next surprised everyone, including the American artillery crews themselves. The fire direction centers processed target information with startling speed. Calculations that once required 10 minutes were completed in 2. Fire commands went to gun batteries via radio, and within moments, shells were in the air. The first German tanks were engaged by artillery fire less than 3 minutes after being spotted. But more impressive than speed was coordination. The FDC system allowed multiple artillery battalions to engage the same target simultaneously without interfering with each other. German tanks found themselves under concentrated fire from dozens of guns positioned miles apart, but firing as though controlled by a single mind. The volume of exploding shells was overwhelming. German forces pressed their attack, but American artillery adjusted fires with a flexibility that German commanders had not anticipated. As tanks maneuvered to avoid concentrations, forward observers called in corrections and new targets. The FDC system processed these changes almost instantly. Shells followed German movements, maintaining pressure and inflicting steady losses. What should have been a powerful armored thrust was being systematically dismantled by artillery fire. The German attack continued for hours, but the outcome was increasingly clear. American artillery was not only matching German capabilities, but exceeding them. The response times were faster. The volume of fire was heavier. The accuracy was excellent. And the ability to mass fires from multiple battalions onto critical targets was proving decisive. German tank crews who had expected to face slow, poorly coordinated American artillery instead found themselves in killing zones where shells arrived within seconds of being spotted. By afternoon, the German attack had failed. Losses in tanks and personnel were severe enough that the 10th Panzer Division withdrew rather than continue pressing against defenses that appeared impenetrable. American forces had held their positions, and artillery had been the decisive factor. After-action reports from Guettar praised the new artillery systems effusively. Officers who had been skeptical about centralized fire direction admitted they had been wrong. The FDC system worked exactly as promised. Forward observers reported they could call in fire missions and have shells landing on target faster than they had thought possible. Gun crews noted that firing direction from FDCs was clear, accurate and timely. Most significantly, German prisoners captured after the battle expressed shock at American artillery performance. They had expected slow, weak American fire support based on earlier encounters. Instead, they had experienced concentrated, responsive, devastating artillery that had shattered their attack. The psychological impact on German forces was notable. American artillery had gained respect. Guettar was the proof of concept, but it was only the beginning. As more American units deployed to Europe and more artillery battalions implemented the FDC system, the true potential would become apparent. The day would come when American artillery would demonstrate capabilities that would shock not just enemies, but allies and neutral observers as well. July 1943. American and British forces invaded Sicily, the first step toward invading mainland Italy. The campaign provided opportunities to further refine artillery tactics under varied combat conditions. American artillery battalions, now confident in the FDC system, began exploring what else was possible. One innovation that emerged was the Time on Target, or TOT mission. Traditional artillery fire missions arrived sequentially as each battery calculated firing solutions and fired in turn. This gave targets warning as the first shells landed, allowing them to take cover before the full weight of fire arrived. Artillery officers realized that with centralized fire direction, it was possible to coordinate fires so that shells from multiple batteries all arrived on target simultaneously. The calculations required were complex. Shells from distant batteries took longer to reach targets than shells from closer batteries. If all shells were to arrive together, distant batteries needed to fire first, closer batteries later, with timing calculated precisely. This required knowing exact positions of all guns, exact distance to targets, and precise calculations of flight times. The FDC system made this possible. The first time on target missions in Sicily were revelatory. German and Italian positions would be under observation with no indication of incoming fire. Then, without warning, dozens of shells would impact simultaneously across the entire target area. There was no preliminary fire to prompt taking cover, no gradual build-up allowing movement to safer positions. One moment there was peace, the next moment there was explosive chaos. The psychological effect was tremendous. Soldiers who survived TOT missions reported they were more terrifying than conventional artillery fire, specifically because there was no warning. The sudden, complete destruction was devastating to morale. Units that took casualties from TOT missions often became unreliable for hours or days afterward, as soldiers remained traumatized by the experience. American artillery also refined techniques for massing fires. Using the FDC system, artillery battalions from different divisions could rapidly coordinate to engage single targets. This was not supposed to be possible under traditional doctrine, where artillery belonged to specific divisions. But the flexible command arrangements and rapid communications of the new system made cross-divisional fires routine. A German strongpoint that might have withstood fire from one artillery battalion found itself engaged by 4 or 5 battalions simultaneously. The concentration of explosive power was overwhelming. Defensive positions that had been designed to withstand normal artillery simply disintegrated under massed fires. German forces discovered that positions they had considered safe were vulnerable when American artillery concentrated its attention. Forward observers also improved their techniques. Initially, observers operated independently, calling fires based on what they could see from their positions. In Sicily, observers began coordinating with each other, sharing target information and ensuring efficient distribution of fire missions. This prevented duplication, where multiple observers called fires on the same target, while other targets went unengaged. The integration of air observation began in Sicily as well. Small aircraft, initially artillery spotting planes called grasshoppers, provided aerial observation that complemented ground observers. These aircraft could see targets beyond ground observers' view, particularly enemy artillery positions hidden behind ridges or in forests. Coordinating air and ground observers with FDC created three-dimensional battlefield awareness that German forces could not match. By the end of the Sicily campaign, American artillery had evolved from the weak, slow force of 1940 into something genuinely formidable. The guns were excellent, the ammunition was abundant, the communications were reliable, the doctrine was sound, and the crews were increasingly confident in their capabilities. The only thing lacking was a really dramatic demonstration of what this system could achieve. That demonstration would come in France, and it would shock the world. June 6, 1944. D-Day. American forces stormed ashore on Utah and Omaha beaches, beginning the liberation of Western Europe. Artillery support for the invasion came initially from naval guns, but within days, artillery battalions were ashore and operational. The Normandy campaign would provide the ultimate test of American artillery systems. The terrain of Normandy was challenging for artillery. The bocage, a landscape of small fields enclosed by thick hedgerows and earthen banks, limited observation and mobility. German forces used this terrain expertly, establishing defensive positions that were difficult to see and harder to attack. Traditional warfare favored defenders in bocage country, and German forces had months to prepare positions. American artillery adapted to these conditions with impressive flexibility. Forward observers learned to use the vertical terrain of the bocage to their advantage, positioning themselves where they could see into German positions. Aircraft observation became even more valuable as grasshoppers flew over the bocage and spotted targets invisible from ground level. The FDC system coordinated information from all sources and directed appropriate fires. The concentration of American artillery in Normandy was unprecedented. By July 1944, several corps were operating in relatively confined areas, each corps having multiple divisions, and each division having substantial artillery support. This meant dozens of artillery battalions were within range of most potential targets. The FDC system allowed coordinating All this firepower with efficiency that would have been impossible under traditional doctrine. German forces in Normandy faced artillery pressure unlike anything they had experienced on the Eastern Front. Soviet artillery was powerful, but tended to be massed for major offensives and then relatively quiet between attacks. American artillery was active constantly, responding to any target that presented itself. German soldiers could not move in daylight without risking artillery fire. Concentrations of vehicles drew immediate attention. Even single snipers, if located by observers, might receive fire from multiple batteries. The Germans adapted by moving only at night, dispersing forces widely, and avoiding any concentration that might draw artillery. These measures reduced casualties, but also reduced combat effectiveness. An army that cannot mass its forces or move freely in daylight is severely handicapped. American artillery was imposing operational constraints on German forces beyond the simple physical damage of explosive shells. Ammunition expenditure was staggering. American artillery in Normandy fired millions of rounds in June and July 1944. Some days, individual battalions fired more rounds than they would have expended in an entire year under pre-war training budgets. This volume of fire was only possible because of the industrial capacity that had been mobilized since 1941 and the logistics system that delivered ammunition to artillery positions in seemingly inexhaustible quantities. German artillery, by contrast, was struggling with ammunition shortages. Allied air superiority interdicted supply lines, making ammunition delivery difficult and dangerous. German batteries that wanted to engage targets often lacked shells. When they did fire, they risked immediate counter-battery fire from American artillery that quickly located German gun positions through sound ranging and flash spotting. German artillery was being suppressed, not through destruction but through making firing suicidally dangerous. The effectiveness of American artillery in Normandy impressed not only the Germans, but also British and Canadian allies, who had extensive artillery experience from years of war. British officers familiar with their own artillery systems observed American operations and noted the speed, flexibility, and volume of fire. Some requested training in American FDC methods to implement in British units. By August 1944, as Allied forces broke out of Normandy and began rapid advances across France, American artillery had established itself as the most effective artillery system in the theater. But the most dramatic demonstration was still to come. It would occur during the Battle of the Bulge, when German forces launched a massive surprise offensive, and American artillery would deliver the response that would shock the world. December 16, 1944. Ardennes Forest. German forces launched a massive surprise offensive through a sector held by inexperienced or exhausted American divisions. The attack, known to history as the Battle of the Bulge, was Hitler's last major gamble in the West. 25 German divisions, including elite Panzer and SS units, smashed into American lines with the objective of reaching Antwerp and splitting Allied forces. The first days were chaotic. American units, caught by surprise, fell back in confusion. Some divisions fought stubbornly, but were overwhelmed by superior numbers. German tanks and infantry penetrated deep into American lines, creating a dangerous bulge in the front. For a few days, it appeared the offensive might achieve significant success. American artillery units, like other forces, were initially disorganized by the surprise attack. Some battalions had to displace rapidly to avoid being overrun. Communication networks were disrupted as units fell back. The situation appeared dire, and artillery's ability to respond effectively was uncertain given the chaos. But the FDC system, even under extreme stress, continued functioning. Artillery battalions that had to displace did so while maintaining communications with higher headquarters. Fire direction centers that had to relocate re-established operations within hours. Forward observers, even when cut off from friendly infantry, continued calling in fire missions via radio. The system was proving resilient under the worst possible conditions. As the initial shock wore off and American forces stabilized defensive lines, artillery began demonstrating its value. German advances, which had been rapid in the first days when they faced scattered resistance, slowed dramatically when they encountered organized defenses backed by concentrated artillery. The same tactics that had worked in Normandy, massing fires from multiple battalions onto critical targets, worked equally well in the Ardennes. German commanders had hoped that winter weather would ground Allied aircraft, negating the air superiority that had hampered German operations throughout 1944. This hope was partially realized as clouds and snow did indeed limit air operations. But the Germans had not adequately considered that American artillery did not depend on air support. Artillery could operate in any weather, and in the Bulge, it became the primary means of delivering firepower. The town of Bastogne became a focal point of the battle. The 101st Airborne Division, encircled by German forces, held the town against repeated attacks. Artillery support was crucial to their defense. Artillery battalions, even when surrounded, continued firing in support of infantry positions. Fire direction centers, operating from cellars and bunkers, coordinated fires that broke up German attacks before they could overwhelm defenses. On December 23rd, the weather cleared briefly, allowing massive American artillery concentrations to be brought to bear. The number of artillery battalions that could coordinate fires through the FDC system had grown to scales unprecedented in warfare. Corps and army artillery could be massed to support divisions under pressure. Dozens of battalions, hundreds of guns, thousands of shells could be directed onto relatively small target areas. German forces attacking toward Bastogne found themselves under artillery fire that defied belief. Shells arrived continuously, in volumes that seemed impossible. Every movement drew fire. Every concentration of forces was engaged. The German offensive, which had relied on mobility and speed, ground to a halt under the weight of American artillery. The climactic demonstration came on December 23, 24, when American forces launched counterattacks to relieve Bastogne. The preparatory artillery bombardments were of unprecedented scale and coordination. Time-on-target missions brought down fires from entire corps simultaneously. German defensive positions that might have held against normal attacks were obliterated before American infantry even advanced. December 24, 1944, a specific German strongpoint blocking the advance toward Bastogne had been identified as the primary obstacle. The position was well fortified, held by experienced troops and protected by difficult terrain. Reducing it would normally require extended fighting with heavy casualties. American commanders decided to demonstrate what modern artillery could achieve. The fire direction centers coordinated a time-on-target mission involving every artillery battalion within range, 18 battalions totaling over 200 guns. The calculations required were complex, accounting for different distances, different gun types with different shell velocities, and different ammunition types. Every battery needed to fire at precisely the right moment so that all shells arrived on target simultaneously. Forward observers and aerial spotters had precisely located the German position. The FDCs calculated firing solutions for every battery, determining the exact second each battery needed to fire, so shells would converge on target at the same instant. The timing had to be perfect, or the mission would revert to standard sequential fire. The psychological impact on German soldiers was profound. Interviews with enlisted men and junior officers revealed that American artillery was the aspect of American military power they feared most. Air attacks were dangerous but sporadic. Tanks could be fought with anti-tank weapons. Infantry could be engaged on relatively equal terms. But artillery was inescapable, unpredictable, and devastating. There was no defense except dispersion and concealment, and even those offered limited protection. German casualty rates from artillery increased steadily from 1943 to 1945, as American artillery became more numerous, better supplied, and more expertly employed. Units that survived artillery bombardments often reported psychological casualties, soldiers who were physically unharmed but psychologically unable to continue fighting. The sustained stress of being under constant artillery threat wore down German combat effectiveness as much as actual casualties. Perhaps most telling, German forces in Italy and France reported that they preferred facing British or Canadian forces to American forces primarily because of artillery. British artillery was competent and well supplied, but American artillery was that and more. The speed, volume, and coordination of American fires made them the most dangerous opponent. This preference for facing anyone except Americans indicated respect that bordered on fear. The transformation of American artillery from 1940 to 1945 remains one of the most dramatic examples of military innovation in modern warfare. In 5 years, American artillery evolved from embarrassingly weak to arguably the most effective artillery system in the world. The story offers lessons that extend beyond artillery or even military affairs. The transformation was not primarily about technology. The 105mm howitzer and 155mm gun were excellent weapons, but so were German artillery pieces. American ammunition was reliable and plentiful, but German ammunition was equally effective when available. The radios American forces used were good, but not dramatically superior to German equipment. The technological advantages were real, but not overwhelming. What made the difference was doctrine, organization, and training. The Via Direction Center system was not a technological breakthrough, but an organizational innovation. It took existing capabilities, guns, radios, mathematics, and combined them in new ways that multiplied effectiveness. The FDC system succeeded because it was based on sound analysis of what made artillery effective: speed, coordination, massed fires, and flexibility. The lesson is that innovation often comes not from developing new tools, but from finding better ways to use existing tools. The artillery officers who developed the FDC system at Fort Sill were not inventing new technology. They were solving organizational and procedural problems. Their innovation was recognizing that centralized fire direction would enable capabilities that decentralized systems could not match. Implementation required overcoming institutional resistance. Many artillery officers were skeptical of the FDC system. It contradicted traditional doctrine. It required new training. It demanded new skills from crews. The natural bureaucratic response to such proposals is rejection, because change is risky and difficult. What allowed the FDC system to succeed was leadership willing to mandate change, even when it was unpopular. The speed of transformation is also notable. From initial concept to full implementation across an army of millions took less than 3 years. This rapid adoption was possible because of wartime urgency and because the system proved itself in combat. Once Guettar and other early tests demonstrated effectiveness, resistance crumbled. Success convinced skeptics more effectively than any argument could have. Post-war American artillery doctrine based on the FDC system became the model that other nations studied and often adopted. NATO's standardization of artillery procedures was heavily influenced by American methods. Even former enemies, including Germany and Japan, incorporated elements of American artillery doctrine when rebuilding their militaries. The innovation that shocked the world became the standard against which artillery effectiveness was measured. Permanent legacy. Principles developed by anonymous American artillerymen remain fundamental in modern warfare. Their silent revolution changed conflict forever. From the training fields of Oklahoma to the frozen valleys of Belgium, from research laboratories to front lines, American artillery went from weak to dominant. It was a transformation that defined the outcome of history's greatest war, and the world would never be the same.